The fire crackled in the darkness as the elder's weathered hands traced ancient symbols in the dirt. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried the weight of centuries. "They are the watchers in the woods," he said, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "The Sasquatch, the ones who walk between worlds." The young tribal members leaned closer, feeling the chill that had nothing to do with the Pacific Northwest wind cutting through the towering cedars around them. "Our ancestors knew them by many names," the elder continued. "Sasquatch from the Salish word Sasquitz. The Algonquin called them Witiko, the Wendigo. The Ojibwe spoke of the Rugaru, appearing in times of great danger." A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. Everyone froze. "They are messengers," the elder whispered, "warning us when we have gone too far, when we have forgotten our place in the natural order." Suddenly, the scene shifts. A frantic voice crackles through a 911 dispatcher's radio. "Something's out here. It's huge. It's watching me from the tree line. Please, you have to send someone." The call cuts to static. We return to the elder, his eyes now fixed on the forest. For thousands of years, they have walked these lands, the dense forests of Washington, Oregon, the hidden hollows of Kentucky, places where ancient trees grow so thick that sunlight never touches the ground. Places where modern man fears to tread. The fire dims, casting longer shadows. But the ancient warnings, the elder's voice grows grave, were just the beginning. Because in recent decades, something has changed. The watchers are no longer content to simply watch. A distant howl echoes through the forest, long and mournful, unlike any known animal. The young people around the fire exchange terrified glances. "The encounters are increasing," the elder concludes, his voice barely audible above the wind. "And they're getting closer to our world." The fire suddenly dies, plunging everything into absolute darkness. In that moment of terror, we hear it again, that impossible howl, closer now, much closer. But the ancient warnings were just the beginning. The lantern flame flickered violently in the Oregon wilderness, casting dancing shadows between the massive Douglas firs. Thomas Mackenzie, a grizzled miner from the California gold rush, held his breath as the light threatened to die completely. It was 1847, and he was 3 days deep into territory no white man had ever mapped. "Just the wind," he whispered to himself, but his voice trembled. The forest around him was impossibly dense, a cathedral of ancient trees that seemed to swallow sound itself. Somewhere in that green darkness, something was watching him. The miners and loggers of the 1840s were tough men, hardened by brutal work and harsh conditions. They feared little, not cave-ins, not claim jumpers, not even the occasional bear. But there was something about these Pacific Northwest forests that got under their skin, something that made grown men abandon profitable claims and flee back to civilization. Mackenzie's lantern suddenly blazed back to life, illuminating the massive trunk of a cedar tree just 10 feet away. But what made his blood freeze wasn't the tree. It was the handprint pressed into the bark, a handprint easily twice the size of his own, with fingers that seemed impossibly long. The stories began spreading through mining camps like wildfire. 7-foot-tall creatures covered in dark hair, walking upright like men, but possessing strength that could snap a horse's neck. They left footprints 18 inches long and threw boulders the size of wagon wheels. The indigenous peoples nodded knowingly when the miners spoke of these encounters. "We tried to warn you," they said. "Some places are not meant for your kind." But then, something impossible happens. The scene shifts abruptly to modern day. A smartphone screen glows in the darkness, showing a news headline, "Bigfoot DNA discovered in Kentucky forests." The date reads 2021. We're suddenly back in 1847. Mackenzie is running now, crashing through underbrush, his lantern swinging wildly. Behind him, the sound of massive footsteps follows, deliberate and unhurried. Whatever is pursuing him doesn't need to run. It knows these woods better than any human ever could. The same forests that terrified miners 180 years ago still hold their secrets. The same ancient trees that witnessed those first encounters between European settlers and the unknown continue to stand sentinel over mysteries that science is only beginning to understand. Mackenzie's lantern finally dies, leaving him in complete darkness. His ragged breathing is the only sound until, from somewhere impossibly close, comes a low rumble that seems to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet. The first contact had been made, but it would be over a century before anyone would believe the stories these desperate men brought back from the deep woods. October 20th, 1967. The day everything changed. Roger Patterson's hands shook as he loaded fresh film into his 16mm camera. He and Bob Gimlin had been tracking reports of unusual footprints along Bluff Creek in Northern California for weeks. The morning mist clung to the creek bed like ghostly fingers, and something felt different about this day. Wrong. Electric. "Roger," Gimlin whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Look." There, less than 100 feet away, something impossible was happening. A massive figure, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, was walking along the creek bed. Not shambling like a bear, not hunched like an ape, but striding upright with a fluid, almost human gait. The creature was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. Patterson's camera began rolling. Frame by frame, he captured what would become the most analyzed piece of footage in cryptozoological history. The creature turned to look directly at them, its face a haunting blend of human and something else entirely. For a moment that lasted an eternity, two species that weren't supposed to coexist stared at each other across an evolutionary chasm. Then it was gone, disappearing into the forest with a grace that defied its massive size. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. In the decades following the Patterson-Gimlin film, experts have analyzed every frame, every shadow, every muscle movement. Computer enhancement, biomechanical analysis, Hollywood special effects experts, all have tried to debunk what Patterson captured that day. They've failed. The creature's gait shows muscle groups that don't exist in humans. The proportions are wrong for any known primate. The way the hair moves, the subtle details of anatomy. If it's a hoax that surpasses anything Hollywood could create even today. Suddenly, the scene shifts to a heated debate in a university lecture hall. "It's obviously a man in a suit," shouts one professor. "The technology didn't exist in 1967 to fake something this sophisticated," counters another. The argument grows more intense, more desperate, as if the very foundations of scientific understanding are at stake. But back at Bluff Creek, something else was happening. The footprints Patterson and Gimlin found weren't just large. They showed dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints. They showed a mid-tarsal break, a foot structure that doesn't exist in humans but would be necessary for a bipedal creature of that size to navigate rough terrain. The film runs for only 59.5 seconds, but those seconds have haunted researchers for over half a century. Because if what Patterson captured was real, it means we share this continent with something that shouldn't exist. Something that has been watching us from the shadows for far longer than we've been watching for it. But this famous footage was just one piece of a larger, more terrifying puzzle. A puzzle that would lead investigators to the dark hollows of Kentucky, where they would discover evidence that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the natural world. Deep in the Appalachian hollows of southeastern Kentucky, where ancient mountains rise like sleeping giants and morning mist never quite burns away, something impossible was discovered. Dr. Mireya Mayer, a world-renowned primatologist who had spent decades studying the most remote corners of our planet, stood before a structure that defied explanation. Massive trees, some with trunks over a foot in diameter, had been deliberately arranged in an intricate pattern. Not fallen, arranged. The strength required to manipulate these giants would be beyond any known North American animal. "This isn't random," she whispered to her team from the Travel Channel's Expedition Bigfoot. "There's intention here, intelligence." The team had used advanced algorithms to identify this 75,000-acre area as having the highest mathematical probability of a Bigfoot encounter. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations and their darkest fears. Bryce Johnson, the expedition's operations leader, ran his hand along one of the massive logs. "Look at this," he said, his voice barely audible. "These trees were twisted off, not cut. Whatever did this has strength that—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Russell Accord, the ex-military survivalist, was examining the ground beneath the structure. His training had taught him to read signs that others missed, and what he was seeing made his blood run cold. "These aren't just random markings," he said. "This is territorial behavior. Something is marking its domain." But it was Ronnie LeBlanc, the team's Bigfoot researcher, who made the connection that would change everything. According to Sasquatch investigations of the Rockies, structures like this are how they communicate with each other. Boundary markers, warning signs. The forest around them seemed to pulse with an ancient intelligence. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every sound could be a signal between creatures that weren't supposed to exist. Suddenly, the scene shifts to a sterile laboratory at UCLA. A technician stares at a computer screen, her face pale with disbelief. "This can't be right," she mutters, running the analysis again. "Run it again," she tells her colleague. "There has to be an error." Back in Kentucky, the team was collecting soil samples from beneath the mysterious structure. Environmental DNA, genetic material naturally shed by all living creatures, would tell them exactly what had been in this area. The samples were carefully sealed and shipped to the UCLA California Environmental DNA Program for analysis. As night fell over the Kentucky wilderness, the team made camp near the structure. The forest around them was alive with sounds, not the familiar calls of known animals, but something else. Something that seemed to be responding to their presence. "Do you hear that?" Dr. Mayer whispered, her scientific training warring with primal fear. "It's almost like communication." The sounds grew closer, more complex. A pattern emerged, calls and responses echoing through the darkness from multiple directions. The team was surrounded, and whatever was out there was coordinating its movements. The DNA results would arrive in 3 weeks. But as the team huddled around their campfire, listening to the impossible sounds in the darkness, they already knew what those results would reveal. The question wasn't whether something was living in these ancient forests. The question was what it wanted with them. The UCLA laboratory hummed with the quiet efficiency of cutting-edge science. Miroslava Mungia Ramos, project manager of the California Environmental DNA Program, stared at her computer screen in stunned silence. The results from the Kentucky soil samples had just finished processing, and what she was seeing challenged everything she knew about North American wildlife. 3,000 reads, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the sterile lab environment. 3,000 individual DNA sequences. In the world of environmental DNA analysis, the number of reads indicates confidence level. The higher the number, the more certain scientists can be that whatever organism they're detecting was actually present in the area. 3,000 reads wasn't just significant, it was overwhelming evidence. But evidence of what? The software does metabar coding, Ramos explained to her colleague, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to the screen. It matches up all the DNA sequences we detect and cross-references them with thousands of published genomes. We found human DNA as expected. Hawks, deer, other animals you'd normally find in Kentucky forests. She paused, her finger hovering over one particular result that made no sense. But we also found pan-genus DNA, chimpanzee DNA, and that's impossible. The silence in the lab was deafening. Chimpanzees don't exist in North America. They never have. The closest wild populations are thousands of miles away in Africa. Yet here was undeniable genetic evidence that something from the pan-genus, the chimpanzee family, had been living in the remote forests of Kentucky. It's a real head-scratcher, Ramos admitted, but her scientific training demanded she report exactly what the data showed. There wasn't just one human primate. We're detecting several different primates, some sort of primate relative that exists in the data. Suddenly, the scene shifts to Dr. Mireya Mayer, receiving the results via encrypted email. Her face goes pale as she reads the findings. As a primatologist who had spent her career studying apes and monkeys around the world, she understood the implications better than anyone. "This is extremely surprising," she said in a video call with her team. "Because there are no known non-human primates in North America, this finding warrants further investigation." But the DNA results raised more questions than they answered. If these creatures were related to chimpanzees, how had they gotten to North America? How long had they been here? And most terrifyingly, how many of them were there? The genetic evidence suggested something that mainstream science wasn't prepared to accept, that North America was home to an unknown primate species, a species that had somehow remained hidden from scientific classification despite leaving clear genetic signatures in the environment. "The DNA findings don't suggest a new species," Dr. Mayer cautioned, "but rather a match to known species of chimpanzee. But that raises an even more disturbing question." The lab results were clear, undeniable, and absolutely impossible according to everything science thought it knew about North American fauna. Yet there they were, printed in black and white, challenging the very foundations of biological understanding. As Ramos saved the results to the secure server, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had just opened a door that perhaps should have remained closed. Because if the DNA was real, if something related to chimpanzees was living in American forests, then every unexplained sighting, every mysterious footprint, every terrifying encounter suddenly became much more credible. But DNA was just one type of evidence. And in the Pacific Northwest, people were reporting encounters that went far beyond genetic traces. 3:30 a.m., September 23, 2009. The Lummi Reservation outside Bellingham, Washington, lay shrouded in absolute darkness. Steve Pavlik, a professor at Northwest Indian College, stepped out of his house on Haxton Way, carrying his travel bags to his truck. He had an early flight to catch, a lecture to give at Fort Lewis College in Colorado. The morning was crystalline clear, cold and crisp, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The kind of Pacific Northwest morning that makes you grateful to be alive. The kind of morning where every sound carries for miles in the still air. Pavlik had lived in this house for several years, nestled between the road and 100 yards of dense forest that stretched down to Lummi Bay. He knew every sound these woods made, the rustle of raccoons, the distant splash of salmon in the bay, the occasional hoot of a great horned owl. He thought he knew what belonged in this forest. He was wrong. The sound that shattered the morning silence was unlike anything in his experience. A loud, piercing cry that seemed to come from the very heart of the woods behind his house, no more than 50 yards away. It was a long, flowing vocalization that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, paused for 2 or 3 seconds, then repeated itself identically. But it was the quality of the sound that made Pavlik's blood freeze. This wasn't the scream of a cougar, the roar of a bear, or the call of any bird he'd ever heard. This was something else entirely, something that his brain immediately categorized as primate. The cry was so loud, so piercing, that it woke every dog within a 1-mile radius. Suddenly, the peaceful morning erupted into chaos as dozens of dogs began barking and howling in response. The sound rolled across the reservation like a wave, dog after dog taking up the alarm until the entire area was filled with their frantic calls. Pavlik immediately turned off his porch lights and stood in the darkness, his heart pounding. For 15 minutes, he waited and listened, hoping to hear the cry again. But whatever had made that sound had fallen silent, leaving only the gradually diminishing chorus of disturbed dogs. The first thought that came to my mind, Pavlik would later recall, was that was a primate. The second thought was Bigfoot. The sound was completely unique, unlike any local animal or bird call he had ever heard. In the days that followed, he would consider every possible explanation, every creature that might inhabit these Pacific Northwest forests. He ruled them out one by one. The closest comparison he could make was to the cries of howler monkeys in the jungles of South America. But howler monkeys don't live in Washington state. Nothing that could make that sound was supposed to exist in North America. As the last of the dogs finally quieted down and silence returned to the reservation, Pavlik stood in his darkened yard, staring into the forest. Somewhere in that tangle of cedar and fir, something had announced its presence, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The Lummi people, he would later learn, didn't question the existence of such creatures. For them, the Sasquatch was as real as the salmon in their waters or the eagles in their skies. Many of his students had their own encounters to share. But for Pavlik, a man of science and education, this was his first glimpse into a reality that mainstream academia refused to acknowledge. A reality where the impossible walked through ancient forests, announcing itself with cries that echoed across the darkness. But the creature wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. September 27th, 2009. 4 days after the piercing cry that shattered the morning silence, Steve Pavlik returned from a successful pheasant hunt at Lake Terrell. The autumn sun was high overhead, and he was looking forward to cleaning his birds at the familiar spot beside his house, a small clearing where the septic tank was buried, right at the edge of the woods. It was broad daylight, safe, normal, or so he thought. Pavlik had set up a pine log as a makeshift cleaning station just 20 feet from Haxton Road. He routinely cleaned his game here, throwing the remains into the woods where raccoons and opossums would carry them off. It was a peaceful ritual, a connection to the land that his Indigenous students would understand. He had just finished cleaning the first pheasant when all hell broke loose. Less than 20 feet in front of him, a large tree began to swing violently from side to side. Not swaying in the wind, there was no wind. This was something else entirely. The tree, with a trunk easily 10 inches in diameter, was being shaken back and forth, as if it were a sapling. But what made Pavlik's blood run cold wasn't just the impossible display of strength, it was the deliberate nature of it. This wasn't some animal thrashing around in panic. This was controlled, intentional, a demonstration. Branches and leaves began falling to the ground as the tree was pounded and shaken. The sound of cracking wood filled the air as whatever was behind the dense brush began breaking branches, snapping them like kindling. The noise was tremendous, the sound of a forest being systematically destroyed by something with incredible power. Pavlik jumped to his feet, his skinning knife in hand, fully expecting something to explode out of the brush to attack him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared into the impenetrable wall of vegetation, unable to see what was causing the destruction just feet away. Robin, his Labrador retriever, had been lying peacefully beside him, chewing on a pheasant wing. Now the dog was on his feet, staring intently into the woods. But here's what was truly unsettling. Robin never growled, never barked, never made any aggressive sound. Instead, he began to back slowly toward the house, his body language screaming fear. The violence stopped for a few moments, and an eerie silence fell over the clearing. Then, suddenly, the massive tree began shaking again, even more violently than before. More branches crashed to the ground, more wood splintered and cracked. The sound was deafening, primal, terrifying. Whatever was in those woods wasn't fleeing. It wasn't surprised or startled. This was a deliberate display of dominance, a clear message: you don't belong here. Pavlik made a decision that probably saved his life. Gathering up his partially cleaned birds, he began a hasty retreat to the house. Robin was already on the porch, waiting for the door to open, his usual confidence completely shattered. The most unsettling aspect of the entire encounter was the silence from the creature itself. No vocalizations, no roars or screams, just the methodical destruction of the forest, carried out with a strength that defied explanation. This wasn't a matter of surprising some large animal and having it flee, Pavlik would later reflect. Whatever I encountered that morning was not fleeing. Although its actions were benevolent, there was a clear intent to scare me off and assert dominance. As he reached the safety of his house, Pavlik turned back to look at the woods. The destruction had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The forest was quiet again, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But the message had been delivered with crystal clarity. This was their territory. He was the intruder. But across the country, from the Pacific Northwest to the Appalachian Mountains, hunters were reporting similar encounters. And the pattern that was emerging was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. They came for elk, but something was hunting them. Near Ukiah, Oregon, the autumn mist clung to the mountainsides like ghostly fingers as an experienced hunter made his way back to camp in the gathering darkness. He had been tracking elk for 3 days in some of the most remote wilderness Oregon had to offer. These were forests where a man could disappear without a trace, where cell phones were useless, and the nearest road was a day's hike away. He was following a familiar game trail when it happened. A rock, not a pebble, not a stone, but a boulder, weighing at least 25 pounds, came crashing through the trees and landed just feet from where he stood. The impact shook the ground beneath his feet. No animal throws rocks. No known animal has the intelligence, the dexterity, or the strength to hurl a 25-pound boulder with accuracy through dense forest. But something had just done exactly that. The hunter froze, his rifle ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest around him was absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. It was the kind of silence that meant predator, the kind of silence that meant danger. Then he saw it, a massive shadow moving between the trees, easily 8 feet tall, moving with a fluid grace that no bear could match. It was watching him, evaluating him, deciding whether he posed a threat. The hunter was an experienced outdoorsman, a man who had faced down charging bears and aggressive cougars. But this was different. This was intelligence. This was something that understood exactly what it was doing. Suddenly, the scene shifts to a hunting lodge in Washington state, where a group of seasoned hunters share their stories around a crackling fire. Each tale is more unsettling than the last. "It followed us for 3 miles, one hunter recounts, his voice barely above a whisper. Never showed itself, but we could hear it moving parallel to our trail, something that big, that heavy, but it never made a sound unless it wanted to." Another hunter nods grimly. "Found our camp torn apart when we got back. Not by bears. Bears don't stack your gear in neat piles. Bears don't arrange your equipment in patterns. Whatever did this was sending a message." The pattern that emerges from these accounts is deeply disturbing. These aren't random encounters with confused animals. These are calculated interactions with something that understands human behavior, something that can predict where hunters will go and what they will do. Back in Oregon, the hunter with the thrown boulder makes a decision that probably saves his life. Instead of pursuing the creature, instead of trying to get a better look, He backs away slowly, never taking his eyes off the tree line. The shadow watches him go, making no move to follow. But the encounters aren't limited to the Pacific Northwest. In Kentucky, hunters report finding massive footprints around their tree stands, prints that appear overnight and disappear just as mysteriously. In North Carolina, hunting parties describe being escorted out of certain areas by something that remains just out of sight, but makes its presence unmistakably known. It's territorial behavior, explains one wildlife biologist who has studied these reports. But it's more sophisticated than anything we see in known animals. These creatures seem to understand property boundaries, hunting seasons, even human psychology. The most unsettling aspect of these encounters is the intelligence behind them. These aren't mindless beasts acting on instinct. These are calculated responses from something that has been watching humans, learning their patterns, understanding their weaknesses. As the fire dies down in the Washington hunting lodge, the men fall silent. Outside, the forest is alive with the normal sounds of night. Owls calling, branches creaking in the wind. But each hunter knows that somewhere in those dark woods, something else is listening too. Something that has been there far longer than any of them. Something that considers these ancient forests its domain. But hunters weren't the only ones working in these forests. And the encounters that loggers were reporting would prove even more terrifying. Chainsaws fell silent when the forest fought back. Mount Hood, Oregon. The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the ancient Douglas firs when the logging crew arrived at their designated cutting area. These were experienced men, third-generation loggers who had worked these forests their entire lives. They knew every sound, every shadow, every danger these woods could present, or so they thought. Jake Morrison, the crew foreman, was the first to notice something was wrong. The trees they had marked for cutting the previous day, massive firs that would take hours to fell, had been stripped of their marking tape, not blown off by wind, not removed by animals, stripped off deliberately and arranged in neat piles at the base of each tree. "Someone's been here," Jake muttered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The nearest road was 5 miles away through terrain that would challenge an experienced hiker. No environmental protesters, no competing logging crews, no one had any business being in this remote section of forest. The crew began their work anyway, but within an hour, the harassment started. First, it was rocks. Not small stones that might fall naturally, but fist-sized rocks thrown with precision from the dense underbrush. They would strike trees just feet from where the loggers were working, the impact echoing through the forest like gunshots. Then the equipment began malfunctioning. Chainsaws that had been running perfectly would suddenly die, their fuel lines mysteriously disconnected. Tool handles would snap under normal use, as if they had been deliberately weakened. Cables would be found cut with something sharp enough to slice through steel. "It's like the forest doesn't want us here," one of the younger loggers whispered, his voice shaking. But it was the sounds that truly terrified them. Deep, resonant calls that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Not the howl of wolves, not the roar of bears, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to be coordinating a response to their presence. Suddenly, the scene shifts to a logging company office in Washington state, where the regional manager reviews incident reports with growing alarm. 17 work stoppages in the past month, he reads aloud. Equipment sabotage, worker intimidation, unexplained phenomena. The economic impact was staggering. Entire logging operations were being shut down by something that left no physical evidence. No clear explanation for the systematic harassment that was driving crews out of profitable timber areas. Back on Mount Hood, Jake Morrison made the decision that would haunt him for years. "Pack it up," he told his crew. "We're leaving." As the loggers loaded their equipment, they could feel eyes watching them from the forest. Not the casual observation of wildlife, but the intense scrutiny of something intelligent, something that understood exactly what it had accomplished. The harassment stopped immediately. The rocks ceased flying. The mysterious calls fell silent. Whatever had been driving them away was satisfied with their retreat. But the most disturbing incident occurred as they were driving out. In their rearview mirror, the loggers saw a massive figure step out of the tree line and watch their convoy disappear down the mountain road. It stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, and remained motionless until they were completely out of sight. "It was making sure we were really leaving," Jake would later tell investigators, like a security guard checking that the building was empty. The pattern was repeating across the Pacific Northwest. Logging crews were reporting similar encounters from British Columbia to Northern California. Ancient forests that had been harvested for generations were suddenly becoming no-go zones, defended by something that understood the economic and environmental stakes better than any known animal should. Insurance companies began refusing to cover equipment losses in certain areas. Logging companies started avoiding profitable timber stands that had become too dangerous to work. The creatures, whatever they were winning a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. As Jake Morrison's crew reached the safety of the main road, they looked back at the forest one last time. Somewhere in those ancient trees, something was watching them go. Something that had just demonstrated that humans weren't the only intelligent species capable of strategic thinking. All the evidence pointed to one terrifying conclusion. But the truth was more complex and more frightening than anyone could have imagined. After decades of evidence, the question isn't whether they exist. The question is, what do they want? In a secure conference room at a major university, Dr. Mireya Mayer spreads out the evidence like pieces of a vast, terrifying puzzle. DNA results from Kentucky showing impossible primate genetics. Audio recordings of vocalizations that match no known North American species. Photographs of footprints with dermal ridges and anatomical features that couldn't be faked. Video footage analyzed by the world's leading experts and found to be authentic. "We have eyewitness accounts from tens of thousands of people," she says, her voice carrying the weight of scientific authority. Hunters, loggers, hikers, indigenous peoples whose families have known of these creatures for generations. The evidence is overwhelming. But it's the pattern of behavior that's most disturbing. These aren't random encounters with confused animals. These are calculated interactions with something that possesses intelligence, strategy, and a deep understanding of human psychology. The territorial displays, the systematic harassment of logging operations, the precise timing of encounters that seem designed to send specific messages, the ability to remain hidden despite leaving clear evidence of their presence. Suddenly the scene shifts to a remote cabin in the Olympic Peninsula, where a witness sits in shadow, his face obscured. "I was a skeptic," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years in the military, trained observer, seen combat in 3 different countries. I don't believe in monsters." He pauses, his hands trembling slightly. "But I saw one. Not a glimpse, not a shadow. I watched it for 15 minutes through binoculars. It was watching our camp, studying us, learning our routines. When it realized I was observing it, it didn't run. It nodded, like it was acknowledging me, like it was saying, 'I see you seeing me.'" The indigenous perspective offers a different understanding. For the Lummi, the Salish, the dozens of Pacific Northwest tribes, these creatures aren't cryptids or unknown animals. They're spiritual beings, guardians of the forest, messengers warning humanity when it has gone too far. "They appear in times of danger," the tribal elder from our opening had said, "when we have forgotten our place in the natural order." The timing is significant. As deforestation accelerates as climate change alters ancient ecosystems, as human encroachment pushes deeper into the last wild places, the encounters are increasing. The creatures are becoming more bold, more aggressive, more willing to reveal themselves. Dr. Meyer returns to her evidence, her scientific training warring with the implications of what she's discovered. The DNA findings don't suggest a new species, but rather a match to known species of chimpanzee. But that raises questions that challenge everything we think we know about North American natural history. How long have they been here? How many are there? How have they remained hidden for so long? And most importantly, what are they trying to tell us? The Patterson-Gimlin film plays one more time, that famous 59.5 seconds of footage that has haunted researchers for over half a century. The creature turns to look directly at the camera, its eyes meeting ours across an evolutionary chasm. In that moment, two species that weren't supposed to coexist acknowledge each other's existence. But there's something else in that gaze, something that looks almost like sadness, as if the creature knows that this moment of contact will change everything, and not necessarily for the better. The conference room falls silent as the implications sink in. If these creatures are real, and the evidence suggests they are, then we share this continent with an intelligence we've never recognized, never respected, never tried to understand. The ancient warning echoes through the darkness. They are the watchers in the woods. They appear when we have forgotten our place. The question isn't whether Bigfoot exists. The question is, what do they want us to understand before it's too late?